Hey, I'm Zaid Ismail, and today I'm stupid enough to want to wade into a discussion that is probably not going to earn me any favors. But I've never done anything because I want favor. So let's be stupid and let's get on with it. The issue of Palestine. The issue of Palestine has been globally unifying and divisive, right? It's revealed what we like to call the true colors of many people because it shows what they stand for. It shows what they're willing to excuse. It shows at what cost do they claim their humanity or do they claim their spirituality even their subscription to their religion. And subscription to religion is not spirituality. It's subscription to religion. And religion creates groups that we identify with because it gives us an identity more than anything else. That's why so many people claim to be of a certain religious persuasion, but they don't actually walk the talk of their beliefs. But all of that aside, the real issue is about understanding what is the Palestine issue all about. But I'm not talking from political perspectives. I'm not talking even from a historical perspective. Historically, you can go and see when it was started and how it is that it was a plot that was specifically designed many, many years, decades, if not centuries before they actually accomplished it. And you'll see how it is that this was a long-term project. But the purpose of the project is misunderstood. I believe it's misunderstood anyway, because we keep thinking that the answers lie in understanding the veracity of the claims and then challenging that. Meanwhile, the answers lie in why is it that it's so easy to use that to have a perpetual argument that keeps it relevant. What I mean is that we keep arguing around the religious kind of dynamics at play about the claims of Zionism versus Judaism versus Christianity, evangelical Christians, and all of that sort of thing. And then Muslims enter the fray, and the best contribution Muslims can make these days apparently is excellent debating skills, excellent oratorial skills, if that's a word, and of course, wanting to show how well versed they are in prophecies from the hadith. I'll come back to that in a minute. Just to simplify it for those who are still on the fringes, and I think a hell of a lot of the people that on social media, a large majority of that is still kind of like seeing this as, yeah, that's such serious stuff. I'm just here for the entertainment, right? So they scroll past, which is why we don't have critical mass yet to be able to turn things around. We still focused on raising awareness. We still focused on protesting. We still focused on raising the conscience of the global population rather than being able to decisively act on this. Which means that if people want to understand what it's really about, it's a simple thing. Just go and watch the Angry Birds movie, the original one. See what it is that played out there between the birds and the pigs, and that will tell you everything you need to know about the overall kind of strategy behind Palestine. All right, and I was hoping to leave this for last, but I think maybe let's just get this out of the way. Terminology. We need to change the terminology because if we keep the terminology going that we've currently got going on this issue, we're going to keep legitimizing and maintaining some sort of credibility around the structures and the institutions that we keep referring to. And there's not a lot of it, right, that I think we need to really pay attention to, except that we need to stop calling it Israeli settlers, because they're not Israeli settlers, they are European settlers in Palestine. And that's an important differentiation, right? The moment you say they're Israeli settlers, we're again legitimizing Israel as being a point of origin. More than that, we're also distracting ourselves from the reality of where these settlers come from and where they return to when their efforts at settling are unsuccessful or just more difficult than they thought it was going to be, like getting resistance to their atrocities. So let's stop saying Israeli settlers. Let's please start calling it European settlers, because that's who they are, all right? And then Europe themselves, if they don't like that term, they must deal with the subjects in their community who are operating as European settlers in a foreign land under illegal pretenses. And the whole legality of it, I don't know if I'm going to even come to that because that leans into the politics of it all, but let's see where we go with this. The next term that we need to change is that we keep referring to it as Israel and Israeli Defense Force in the kind of democratic processes and structures in Israel. No. We have occupied Palestine and we have an illegal presence in that space that is pretending to be legitimate. It's as simple as that. All right, there is no legitimacy to their presence there, and there was no need for the separation of the states and all of that in the first place because there was harmony and there was peace in that land before that, which talks to another more important issue, which is what's the real reason for Israel being established? It's got nothing to do with religion. It's got nothing to do with the red heifers. It's got nothing to do with rebuilding the Temple of Solomon and all of that sort of thing. Those are all distractions. I'll hopefully come back to that, or maybe I won't. I don't know. It doesn't add up. All of the things that we focus on, we think, well, yeah, you see there, that's what they're doing, and that's how they're preparing, and that's the people that are preparing all of that, the people that are focused on all of that. They're not driving political agendas. They're just opportunists because they have an opportunity created for them to be able to reclaim some ancestral kind of scripture-based claim to space in a land and a right that in itself is just ludicrous. And that's what then gets the focus. You see, they're doing it for this. They're doing it for the Temple Mount. They're doing it for Al-Aqsa and all of that. It's got nothing to do with that. That's just the opportunistic outcome. Because the ones who are actually driving and funding this entire venture, they are benefiting from it in other ways, and that's where they're getting desperate, right? They're getting desperate because if anyone's paying attention to global politics and economics, you'll see that they're crumbling. Their interest base is crumbling. Their centers of influence and power is crumbling. And as a result of that, they need to find an alternate strategy to remain relevant and to remain powerful, dominant in some way. And what the land of Palestine offers them is that control over critical global trade routes that will put them in a position of power, like how Yemen has established power over those trade routes. And other trade routes around the world, key ones like the Panama Canal and the Straits of Hormuz, all of these critical global shipping and trade corridors and that are not under the direct control of these imperialist kind of forces, right? So this is about business, it's about money, it's about power grabs. It's not about religion. And religion has been used very successfully for hundreds of years to distract us from what it is that the puppeteers at the back are actually trying to achieve through all of this. Anyway, the last terminology that I think needs to change very desperately because it's just a blatant kind of stupidity to continue calling it what we call it. That is mainstream media. And then some people call it legacy media. It's neither one of the two. It's corporate media. We need to call it corporate media because it's been proven repeatedly that it protects corporate interests of its owners, right? Its owners are oligarchs and capitalists, basically. And they are driving a narrative. If they're driving a narrative, then that means you're protecting a corporate interest. It's like if you're working in a corporate company, right? You'll see that whatever the corporate kind of strategy and objectives are, that's what's going to prevail over what's the right thing to do. This is where a lot of workplace stress comes in, is where corporate politics and corporate ethics, so to speak, override personal value systems and personal ethics, right? And then that creates that contention, and then people feel as if they're party to something that is just unjust or unfair, and they feel treated unfairly because they don't subscribe to that, and they don't see why it is that it should play out in this way. And then you see the nepotism, and you see the corruption and the unethical behavior, and you see how the departments that are supposed to protect staff interests actually protect company interests and all of that. That's basically the same thing. So the ones in power will dictate what is the acceptable standard of how we're going to operate, but they're also going to approve the optics, how we want to appear to operate. And that's what Palestine is all about. That's what corporate media is all about. It's about protecting that narrative, but we keep demanding that they must be honest. They're not going to be honest because honesty is going to work against their objectives. So if they are controlled, if they are owned, and we know for a fact that there is massive deliberate strategies and deliberate directives that prevent them from being objective and prevent them from being fair in their coverage of events, not just in Palestine, but globally, then we're stupid for still wanting to appeal to them to be more honest. Because they're not serving honesty, they're not serving the global good. They're serving corporate interests, right? So it's corporate media. Then I want to move on to what we love to do most, especially as Muslims. And this is, again, coming from where I come from. I'm talking about my experience and what I'm exposed to. And as Muslims, the one thing that we love to do is celebrate the faith and the strength of the iman of the Palestinian people. Now, just to clarify, I am not for 1 second questioning their level of faith or iman. I'm questioning why it is that we find it so easy to keep romanticizing that without realizing that a massive contributing factor towards them acting with such faith is because they know they can't rely on the Ummah. They said it themselves. I'm not just putting this, I'm not projecting my view on this, right? They said it themselves. There's numerous reports and reels and content that comes out of Palestine by Palestinians themselves. And even at an event I attended a couple of months ago, where there was a Palestinian journalist who was present as a special guest. And I asked him, what is the feeling on the ground of the Palestinians regarding the response of the Ummah? And he said straightforward, they feel betrayed. So if you know that your backstop, the people who are supposed to have your back, who are supposed to be there to protect you if you are under threat, your allies, so to speak, and in this case, your brothers and your sisters in Islam, if you know that they're not going to show up for you, obviously your only recourse is to rely on Allah and yourself. Khalas. There's nothing more to it. And then we come along, the very people who are actually letting them down, come along and celebrate that iman of theirs. Seriously? That doesn't make sense. It reveals a real deficit of conscience and understanding on our part to have to place so much of emphasis on look at the iman. Look how they're still making salah in the rubble and in the shade of the fallen minarets and things like that. Alhamdulillah, good for them. They're doing that, right? But for us to look at that without feeling absolute shame and guilt, knowing that the reason they're doing that is because we are impotent in our response to that, that's what I'm talking about. Where is that conscience? And talking about conscience, it then brings me to the point of boycotts, right? Boycotts are not about politics. Boycotts are not about whether it's Islamic to do so or not, or whether Islam supports it or not, or whether the timing for it is correct or not. It's none of that. Boycotts is about conscience. It's about saying that I know I'm spending this $100 of mine on takeaway, and the person who's selling me this takeaway food, this fast food, is going to use $10 out of that $100, and they're going to support the aggressors who are slaughtering and starving my fellow Muslims. So what happened to that unity in the Ummah and the empathy that we're supposed to have? So your conscience is what allows you to be associated with something that is dubious or is just downright horrific. And if as a Muslim trader, you're still making excuses for why it is that you need to stock such products, then you need to understand that you are more invested in your revenue than you are in your conscience. And it also means that you place more faith in secular economic models than you do in who your actual provider is. Ar-Razzaq, Allah. So that hypocrisy is then, the hypocrisy that is pervasive in the Ummah is now exposed and revealed and surfaced through our response to boycotts and protests and what we need to do for Palestine. Because our greatest response so far has been protests by small pockets of society, relative to the numbers that we should be in, and charity. And then we celebrate how charitable we are. And for me, the thing that's really shameful about that is that if I've got someone that I claim to love and care for, who is currently got the boot of an aggressor on their neck with a gun to their head, and they ask me, please just help me out here. I'm overpowered. I can't do anything. I can't resist this because I don't have the means or the resources to do so. Help me. And my response is, here's a glass of water. Where's our conscience? Where's our empathy? What are we really doing it for? Are we doing it because we want to be charitable, or are we doing it because we really believe that that is the best that we can do to support them? Because then the next thing I would question is, if we were truly united in our response to Palestine, one ummah and all of that, why do we need hundreds of charity organizations instead of one very efficient, very powerful one that is effective and that has critical mass, so we don't have duplication of resources, duplication of costs, and all of that? Because charity, unfortunately, has become a business. And because it fulfills an important aspect of our religious code, we don't want to question that. That's what happens when you resort to ritualistic spirituality rather than true conviction in the beliefs and the ethics and the values and the principles that Islam demands of you, right? So moving on from that, the next thing that usually comes up is how we distract ourselves with the sectarian debates and the debates about prophecy. And the one thing that fascinates me in a very morbid and disturbing way is that there's always people ready to talk about how it is that this is prophecy, but don't realize that the fact that they are talking about it means that they are living in the time when they become the reason for that prophecy being fulfilled. Let me explain that a bit further. What I'm saying is that if I'm here sitting and talking about how it is that we, at a time when the Ummah is large in numbers and we as weak as the foam on the ocean and all of that, right? And I'm debating, I'm talking about it like, hey, look, that's why Palestine is the way it is, and this is part of it, and now we must wait for the Mahdi to come, and Dajjal is going to show up, and some people are saying Dajjal is here already, and Yajuj and Majuj, or Gog and Magog, have already broken the seal. And understand something. The only reason any of that would come to pass is if the majority have lost their way. Are you part of the majority, or are you part of the minority? Do you have a conscience that's guiding you, or do you have a distraction that is occupying your focus? Debating about prophecy is an indulgence in the ego, because it's about wanting to be seen to be so knowledgeable. There's a difference between some sincere advisors who are making us aware of, like, listen, you're the personification right now in your conduct. You're the personification of that prophecy that's coming true. So what do? Do you surrender to it, or do you own it and you say, I don't want to be part of that prophecy. I don't want to be the reason why that prophecy comes true. I don't want to be the reason why it is that we are as weak as the foam on the ocean. So then I have to do something more meaningful. I have to act with more resolve. I have to have a conscience at the very least to say that I'm not going to support those who are causing the aggression and the oppression. But if I don't have at least that level of self, of conscience, of understanding, of accountability in my contribution to what it is that I don't like around me, then I'm going to keep blaming secular structures and the UN and America and all of this nonsense. No, they can only exist and operate the way they do in the absence of real resistance. And that resistance doesn't have to be militant. It just has to be resistance in being able to fund their efforts. And how do they fund it? They fund it through the numerous companies that are benefiting from operating with them. And that's what it is. It's all about business. It's all about money. It's all about greed and power. It's got nothing to do with religion. No one cares about whether or not the Temple Mount is going to be rebuilt. The ones who are really driving this, they don't care about that. It's like, okay, if that's going to be a suitable distraction for us, let them have their Temple Mount while we get the trade routes, or we get the control over the resources, or we get control over the region, because that's what we want, right? Because it's resource rich, natural resources. And if you look at that, you'll see that colonization over the centuries has always focused on what they wanted from those people. They didn't just want to dominate those people for no reason. It was that those people had something that they wanted. That's why they wanted to dominate them. And then finding an excuse to dominate them, the sheep of the global population, the blind followers of religion, who become easy pawns to manipulate because of those religious contentions that exist. We need to hold ourselves accountable for why it is that we're so easily manipulated, rather than constantly blaming the manipulators for manipulating us. So if I had to try to determine the difference between the Ummah and the global population, right now, there isn't much difference. In fact, I could go as far as very unpopularly pointing out that there is more resolve and direct action from non-Muslims than there are from Muslims, even though Muslims claim that this is the third holiest site in Islam, and we are bound by religious belief and commitment and conviction to protect it. So why aren't we? Why is it that the flotillas are led by non-Muslims? Why is it that boycott action is not done under the banner of Islam, or is not championed by the Ummah? It's actually something that is a secular initiative that has to span across different religions and things, because we can't rely on the 2 billion Muslims that we've got in the world today. We're ready to celebrate how many people are reverting to Islam. And that emboldens us and makes us feel good, because our association with Islam is what it is that we take pride in. Our association with Islam. And that's because we have a low self-esteem. As an ummah, our self-esteem is extremely low. That's why we're constantly looking for validation, constantly trying to prove to people that we're right and they're wrong, and that we have an uncontaminated scripture, and theirs is compromised in so many ways, and all of that. The fact that it's against the Sunnah to go and debate about religion, like just willfully and whimsically and flimsily go and just look for opportunity to debate about religion. The fact that that's against the Sunnah, we don't even consider that, right? Because as long as we're showing the superiority of Islam, then that makes us feel good, because it feeds our ego, not because that's what's actually needed. Live it, and you won't have to preach it. Simple. But I'm idealistic like that, and I may be naive, and I may be even offensive in what I'm saying, but I just think that we need to seriously question what it is that we claim to stand for when our actions don't reflect that. We stand for justice, but we're willing to turn a blind eye to injustice. And if you want to see how ridiculous all of this is, just step back and consider how it is that after, let's use historical context just to demonstrate the point. After almost 80 years of absolute non-compliance with UN charters, after almost 80 years of blatant disregard for international law, for blatant disregard of justice, in establishing a fair and equitable solution in what is supposed to be the Palestinian territories that were now split by people who had no right to split it in the first place. Despite all of that, who are we still appealing to fix it? Who are we still respecting as being the institutions of law and order around the world to be able to find a solution to this? Who are we waiting to still enforce that law? Now, here's the thing, right? In every institution, there are those who agree with the ideals, the stated ideals of the institution, and they are sincere in their efforts in an individual capacity. So I'm not saying that everyone who works for these institutions are themselves contaminated or corrupt. I'm saying that they become pawns because they give the institution legitimacy while they know the institution is actually acting in bad faith. So again, where's the conscience? And conscience is directly related to self-worth, self-respect. What you hold yourself to is what you're going to act on. The moment you believe that your principles are subject to conditions, it's not a principle anymore. So the reason why something like what's happening in Palestine can continue directly in our faces, where anyone from any age group can see harrowing footage live streamed about what is actually being done and still feel unmoved by it, or at most sad or disturbed, and some traumatized, but still not enough to prompt us into action, direct action. You have to question what's wrong with that picture. And what's wrong with that picture is not what's happening in Palestine. It's about the people who are observing it and who are impotent in their response to it, who are still focused on talking about sectarianism rather than focused on the solution. So when our self-worth is low, we start taking assurance from these things that receive respect. And that's, for the most part, why it is that a lot of people profess to be part of a certain religion. Not just Muslims. I'm not attacking Muslims. In fact, I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just pointing out my observations about what I believe is things that need more focus and more attention so that we can actually do something about it meaningfully, so that it ceases to be contributing factors in what it is that's playing out around us. And I want to come back to the prophecy thing just now as well, if I remember. So when who we are is not enough, when we have a low self-esteem and we're afraid that that in itself is going to be inadequate to secure the respect and the social standing that we need or that we want for ourselves, we'll associate ourselves with something that has to be respected. And religion right now, in secular law, has to be respected. Not the fact that I live my life according to a certain code and that's why I'll be respected. But no, it's what I'm associated with. That's why if you attack my religion, if you attack my race, if you attack my demographic, then I'll feel personally attacked. Why? Because that's where I've derived my identity from. So that is what it is that makes me feel significant, that gives me reason to believe that I deserve respect. And that's why we will respond much more strongly if our identity that's associated with that, if that is going to be attacked, we will respond more strongly to that rather than responding strongly to actual horrific events around us. That's what breeds complacency, and that's what breeds this naivety of believing that no, you must be measured, you must have wisdom in your response and all of that. Where's the wisdom in being silent about a genocide? Where's the wisdom from our self-proclaimed community leaders in remaining silent or actively avoiding tough discussions about the state of the Ummah relative to the response of the Ummah to this genocide? Where's the wisdom in ensuring that we use our public platforms, including the most important platform, which is the Friday pulpit, the minbar, from being used for such political discussions? In over the span of a year, I think if I would be able to hear one or two discussions in the masjid, in the mosque, specifically and directly and clearly focused on the dilemma of Palestine and the Ummah, it would be a lot. The rest of the time is the usual stuff. Reward and punishment, fear, shame, judgment, sectarianism. That's what we've become distracted by. That's what we've become consumed by. And you see, the people with resources, they see these as fault lines. And as always, if you want to weaken someone because you want to get what they have, you emphasize the fault lines. You create that discord between them. Not because you care about it, but because as long as they are distracted by those fault lines, you can continue to ravage their resources. And the worst thing in all of this is that the people who are at the heart of this don't see it. And then when they do realize that they're being ravaged in that way, they go and appeal to someone else to save them. They don't actually step up themselves. You know, I came across a hadith once that said something about you must go out to meet your enemy. You don't wait for them to come into your home, right? So we know who the enemy is. Why are we still waiting for someone to save us from them? Why is it that we can't even boycott effectively? Why is it that in South Africa alone, the protest action is incongruent with the effectiveness of boycotts? It doesn't make sense. Why is it that in the Western Cape, and I'm picking on my brothers and sisters in the Western Cape now, why is it that you've got the most vocal Palestinian campaigners there, pro-Palestine campaigners there, yet you still voted for a Zionist party? These are awkward discussions that we don't want to have because it's not politically correct. The funders and the donors don't like it when we talk about these things. Why? Because they're in bed with the Zionists. And that's how those who blindly follow religion become pawns in capitalism. And that's what Palestine is all about. It's about capitalism, nothing more. It's about wanting to control resources so that they can enrich themselves and feel powerful in the process because of their lacking self-worth. And as a result of that, they distract your attention by making it seem like it's a religious issue. It's not a religious issue. It's got nothing to do with the Holocaust. It's got nothing to do with land for the Jews. But those Jews, and I'm saying those Jews because not all Jews are the same, and I'm not even going to get into that debate, right? But the point is that the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims who play to this religionist kind of politics, they become the pawns in someone wanting to be able to create strife and conflict so that while you're distracted with all of that, they raping the resources of your land. Colonialism 101, and I didn't even go to university. But the point is, let's just be simple and logical about this. Nothing in the mainstream makes sense because it is all focused on the distractions. It's not focused on the actual root causes. So when we want to talk about standing up for justice and everything else, that doesn't start out in the public space. It starts at home. You know, it reminds me of this incident that happened once. I came out of the mosque and there was this one young guy who had a Palestinian flag pinned, sticking out of this window in his car, and he parked on the incorrect side of the road, facing oncoming traffic, halfway into the street itself, inconveniencing and blocking the flow of traffic. Right? And as he jumped into his car, I was walking past him, and I looked at the Palestinian flag, and with a deliberate jibe at him, I looked at him and I said, how can you be protesting for Palestine while you park like a Zionist? He didn't like that. But there was a lot of truth to that jibe. We don't hold ourselves accountable for how we conduct ourselves. We just focus on how it is that we want to appear, what it is that we want to be seen, associated with. Hold yourself accountable for your conduct, and automatically you are less likely to be a pawn in someone else's politics. Right now, the protests have their place. It raises awareness. But how much more awareness do we need to raise before we decide, okay, the awareness is there, now it's time to act? When are we going to start taking direct action against the complicit business people in our own environment who continue to be flippant about their support for Zionist products and Zionist lines of business while claiming to be Muslim, while claiming to be conscientious objectors to what's happening in Palestine? When are we going to start pushing back on people who are self-indulgent about their debates and arguments about prophecy and about religious views and fatwas and everything else, while they actually treat others no different to how the Zionists treat others? You know, that whole Goyim mentality. It's not only with the Jews and the Zionists. That Goyim mentality exists in our own community. That's why we have classism that's rife. We have the wealthy who won't associate with the poor, and we have the poor who worship the wealthy or who would go in and curse the wealthy while they're begging for relief from them or support from them. It's all over, it's rife. And the underlying common denominator in all of this is a low self esteem. You have no self respect. That's why you make yourself available to be someone else's pawn. If you respect yourself, you're going to be more conscientious and more resolute about what you stand for. And you're going to put in more effort and understanding to before you make yourself available to someone else's manipulations. But if your focus is only on self-enrichment and self-preservation, you're not going to do that, right? You're not going to worry about where your money is going and who you're supporting and all of that, because then you focus on your struggle. Life is difficult enough as it is. It's complicated enough as it is. So why must I make it more complicated and more difficult by worrying about all of these things? I'm just trying to have a peaceful life and provide for my family. Okay. But then don't complain when what you've been struggling to provide is then unjustly ripped away from you by people who don't care about that. Why is it that 20 odd months into a genocide, forget about the previous 80 years or 100 years, 20 odd months into a genocide, the Muslim community, especially in South Africa, hasn't come up with alternatives to the Zionist lines of business? Why? Because we don't have resources? No, we've got mega wealth in our community. Because we don't have opportunity? No, we've got all the freedoms we need in this country to practice our religion freely and to trade freely. Freedom of association as well. And again, I come back to the litmus test. Western Cape. Very strong, vocal, mostly unified Muslim community that votes for Zionists because it's more convenient. Because they trust them to take care of their interests, even though there's massive evidence to confirm that they are actually gentrifying the whole of the Western Cape as far as possible so that they can get rid of the elements that they would rather not have to work with or deal with or take care of. And we know those elements. Those elements are the Cape Flats and those communities. And as much as this seems like a political discussion, it's not. I'm asking, when is it that we, as a Muslim community, South African Muslim community, and then the global Ummah, when are we going to take stock of ourselves before we lose ourselves to the politics and the debates and the arguments that are pervasive in the distracted spaces around us? There's value in some people raising awareness and pushing back and engaging in those spaces, but not everyone. Vote with your money. Boycott. If you have a conscience, you wouldn't want to walk into a restaurant that you know is supporting Zionist interests. If you have a conscience, you wouldn't want to go and buy that lacquer coffee or that lacquer cold drink or whatever it is that you're looking for, just because you can, while you know that that money is going to be used for something that you claim morally not to stand for. I was hoping this was going to be a bit of a lighter discussion, but I guess it's not entirely possible. Well, not possible. It's difficult to keep it light because that in itself is an insult to the struggles of the people who are suffering because of our inaction and because of our complacency. As an ummah, we are so focused on prophecy that we don't realize that we are the fulfillment of that prophecy. Remember, none of that would come to pass if we weren't in the state that would make it possible for that to come to pass. And that's why the Day of Judgment is always talked about when certain conditions prevail. Because we have agency to choose how we're going to behave, how we're going to conduct ourselves, how we're going to operate. That will determine whether that when comes to pass, when that situation is going to be prevalent. And my favorite hadith of all time is the one that talks about if you see the hour approaching, if you see the day of Qiyamah in front of you even, if you can see it approaching, and you've got a sapling, a plant in your hand, you should plant it. You shouldn't give up hope and be like futile about like, oh, what's the point in planting this because there's the day of Qiyamah? No. The hadith tells us straightforward, simple. If you have something that you are capable of doing that is going to be good, you do it. You don't worry about what it is that's coming towards you. You do what you need to do. You do what you know is right. And again, I come back to the boycott issue. Why is it that something as simple as a boycott is something that we've been debating for decades? Because I remember having debates with various people more than 10 years ago about why it is that Coca-Cola should be boycotted. 10 years later, a genocide later, live streamed to our phones, we're doing all of these protest actions and everything else, but we're still not taking boycott seriously. We still see people who are dressed in religious garb, Muslims, looking beautiful, mashallah, with all of the appearance of the sunnah and everything else. And their shopping carts are full of Zionist products, without a care in the world. And it's not because of lack of awareness and lack of knowledge, because the information is far too pervasive for anyone to claim that they didn't know anymore. It's simply because we don't have a conscience. And that conscience is because we don't have self-worth and self-esteem, because our self-worth and self-esteem is derived from our association with what appears to be pious and appears to be goodness and all of that. And as a result of that, we lose the one critical thing that is completely absent in all of this: empathy. And because we don't have empathy between each other, we don't have empathy for what's happening in Palestine. Because empathy will make it impossible for us to sit here smug, celebrating the faith of the Palestinians, while we know we're sitting with Zionist products in our kitchens. We've lost the plot. Well, whether this will create opportunity to have more important discussions, or whether it will be ignored, or whether it will be, I don't know, protested or cancelled, I don't know. I'm not doing this for any specific outcome. I just think it's important for us to be able to talk about these things, because unfortunately our leaders are not talking about it. I'm not interested in being a leader. I'm not trying to be a leader. I'm just acting on what my conscience tells me I need to act on. And if I'm misguided in that, then I'm always open to anyone engaging with me sincerely to let me know what it is about what I'm saying and my way of going about doing it. What about that is specifically problematic, so that I can correct that. But unfortunately, most often, people will tell me that they don't like what I'm saying, but they won't tell me what it is that they would want me to do instead. Which means that it's just because of how we feel about things that we are driven to action, rather than our conscience, conscious thought, understanding, logical approaches. That doesn't drive our behavior anymore. Conviction doesn't drive it. Our emotions drive everything, which is why we are so self-centered and self-absorbed these days, because we are focused constantly on how we feel about things rather than what is the right thing to do. I'm Zaid Ismail. I look forward to your thoughts on this, and I trust that we can keep it civil if there is going to be any contention around this, but let's see where it goes. Assalamu alaikum.